You're listening to episode 246 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Ira Rechtshaffer joins us to speak about mindfulness and madness, money, food, sex, and the sacred. When you hear the phrase, "you're out of your mind," what does this call to mind? For me, it's tinged with madness, and that may not be quite so far from our experience, that when we're not present, running on autopilot, and away from our mind, we're not always behaving in the most sane way. So how does this tie to our very ancient Buddhist way of being? Ira Rechtshaffer holds a PhD in Buddhist studies and has been a Buddhist meditation practitioner for 40 years. He studied and practiced Zen Buddhism in Japan and has been a practitioner of Vajrayana Buddhism since 1976. He has been a psychotherapist for the past 25 years, integrating spiritual vision with psychological process in an effort to return soul to the helping relationship. Special thanks to our old friend Tim Ward for making the introductions for today's interview. So sit back, relax, and have a nice orange ginger tea. Our guest today is Ira Rechtshaffer. Ira, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Good morning.
So tell us a little bit about your background with Buddhism.
It's a long background for a white guy. Very early on, meaning in my late teens, I began to feel largely nihilistic, having lost the thread of sacredness and meaning, just feeling that nothing in my world seemed to reflect anything that was of a higher principle or a sacred principle. And so I lived a very ordinary teenage life, and somewhere in the middle of university, I began to connect with yoga. The Eastern traditions somehow made their way to my library, and I began to read about yoga. So I started studying with a wonderful man named Swami Satchidananda in New York City. And after a couple of years of doing yoga and reading about the Upanishads, reading the Gita, reading the abbreviated version of the Ramayana, one thing led to the next, and somehow Alan Watts landed in my lap. And that was a major door opening, because from Alan Watts, I began to feel more and more drawn towards Buddhism in general, Zen specifically. This is in the late 60s now, so there's a big cultural revolution happening in the country. There's a lot of excitement, and I left New York. I just began traveling in my little Toyota, in my camping gear, and I didn't land, but passing through San Francisco, I somehow auspiciously was not drawn, but I was led to the California Institute of Asian Studies. And from there, I began to connect with a lot of Buddhist teachers from Thailand, from Burma, China, Japan. coincidentally, the San Francisco Zen Center was right, I would say, walking distance from the school that I was going to. So I'm taking you to the year 1973, 74, 75. And that's when I began practicing Zen and pursuing a PhD in Buddhist studies. So that was you might say, the original spark. I had studied the Asian traditions as part of my graduate school training, but something clicked when the Buddhist teachers spoke. They were coming very much from a practitioner's mentality. And there was something in the air, something energetically would shift when they spoke. And I think what I was picking up on was the difference between talking about spirituality and someone actually walking the path, living it. And that was the real magnetic pull for me to Buddhism. So one thing led to the next. And from Zen Center, I met Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, this wild, crazy wisdom, wild Tibetan man who was the most extraordinary person I have met to date. That was my invitation, my connection to the world of Vajrayana Buddhism. So that's kind of a brief overview. It goes on from there, but that's at least at first blush. I also spent 4 years in Japan in several Zen monasteries. This is after I had met Chogyam Trungpa, and after being a Vajrayana practitioner, I still had a thing for the Japanese culture. And so it's something I needed to do. And so that, you might say I have a foot in both the world of Zen and in the Vajrayana practice.
And I can understand having that multicultural, multi-background in Buddhism stance, having started in Zen myself and then discovered Theravada and still having a deep admiration and practice in Zen. One doesn't take away from the other, that they can be complementary. Have you found that to be the case for yourself?
They can. I mean, I think these different traditions we're talking about are culturally specific. So there's a flavor that's slightly different from the other, but still it's fundamental Buddhism. Still talking about suffering, its cause, and relief from it. It's still the path.
Well, let's shift a bit and start talking about your new book, Mindfulness and Madness, Money, Food, Sex, and the Sacred. There's quite a lot of deep concepts involved in that title. Let's maybe start with what the focus is and then unpack some of that.
I think the main focus was the relationship between mindfulness and madness. What would that be? Because they seem opposites, and it seems like there's a fork in the road. I wanted to demonstrate how we have a choice at any moment to either be present with whatever it is that we're experiencing and open to that, embrace that, or, as is the case 99.7% of the time for most of us, discursive mind is fickle, and we're all over the place. We're there and then rather than here and now. And the consequence of being there and then is what I'm referring to loosely as madness. It's the feeling of simply not being present. And it's the quality of being basically lost when we're elsewhere, while we're talking with someone, or elsewhere when we're sipping our coffee, or petting our cat, or doing our work. Then we're basically lost. Our body is in one place and our mind is elsewhere. And so madness, in my loose definition, is that quality of being distracted, forgetful, absent-minded, and suffering, fundamentally suffering, losing contact with the basic energy of this present moment.
So how does your own Vajrayana practice influence what you wrote about?
Yeah, how can it not? Trungpa Rinpoche was the deepest person that I have ever met being in his presence and some of the great teachers of the Kagyu and Nyingma lineages of Tibetan Buddhism, there are 4 lineages, so I mentioned 2 of them, Kagyu and Nyingma. Trungpa Rinpoche introduced us to this family of lineage holders, and being around them was just extraordinary for both myself and a whole generation of Vajrayana practitioners, because it was the first time that we were in the company of human beings that were remarkably and profoundly present in whatever they did. And they were operating kind of on a different frequency. There was a certain power and beauty and skillfulness to them just being who they were. And that is something you never ever forget, because it speaks to your body, it speaks to your cells and molecules. It's not something you have to remember or recall. It's a communication that happens, I think, under the radar, where you can talk about it, but something shifted in your own body when you were in their magnetic sphere. So that has been a lifelong relationship with such human beings, has been a lifelong impression. And I think I didn't think of that connection specifically as the motivation to write such a book, but it was simply, you might say, the very basis for having the confidence to even say these things. In other words, I didn't have any doubt, none whatsoever, in writing the things. I had doubt whether I was saying it skillfully and creatively enough, but I didn't have doubt about the authenticity of the ideas, because I witnessed and was in relationship with human beings that lived these very ideas that I was communicating. Is that clear? Am I making sense?
That does, and I'm wondering if we could explore a little bit the subtitle of Money, Food, Sex, and the Sacred. How does that relate to what you're talking about?
Well, it's interesting that Buddhism, perhaps more than many religions, prides itself on being in the world, that it's not a transcendental, otherworldly tradition, but that it encourages its practitioners to find the Buddha's way in the midst of money, food, and sex, which really means the vital life that's lived every day, the nuts and bolts, the kitchen sink quality to everyday life. I have to eat in order to survive. I have to work in order to make money. I have sex for pleasure, but I have sex also to make babies. So, in many ways, money, food, and sex describes everyday life. And interestingly, those are the 3 areas where we also lose it, where we become either addicted to money, food, / substance, and sexuality / pleasure. We become highly neurotic around those areas. At the same time, spiritual practitioners have a reputation for trying to renounce money, food, and sex. And so it's interesting, there's either a quality of going overboard, or there's a quality of attempting to renounce. And the Buddhist middle path is largely about neither hedonism or asceticism. Mm-hmm. So money, food, and sex was really a good expression for a good expression for how to understand the very areas where we attempt to renounce or indulge. Mm-hmm. Therefore, it was a good pivot to talk about the many ways that we practice the middle path.
You've also included the word sacred there, and the sacred. I'm wondering if you could unpack a little bit what your meaning is with the word.
It's interesting that, as you well know, Ted, that Buddhism is a non-theistic tradition, meaning that it doesn't rely on or depend on God as the center of the whole tradition. So many people mistakenly feel, even Buddhist practitioners feel that Buddhism is atheistic. But actually it's non-theistic. It doesn't reject the notion of the divine or the sacred. And the way that the Vajrayana talks about the sacred is through meditation practice and through devotion to the teachings. At some point, little by little, we begin to quiet the discursive mind, the rambling, tangential mind, what's loosely called monkey mind. And when we're able to do that increasingly so, we're able to actually have very naked perception. We are actually able to see the steam, the mist rising from my cup of tea on the table. We're able to experience morning light filling up my room, or listening to rain beating on my windows. We see and we hear with such clarity that there's something absolutely subtle and meaningful about those sensory phenomena. In Vajrayana Buddhism, that's called sacredness, where we sense some kind of basic goodness, some kind of basic health or purity when we are seeing, hearing, and feeling without monkey mind projecting all kinds of narratives and value judgments over those simple experiences.
Yeah, it's interesting that our views of the sacred may be what others of us, like myself, may consider secular as simply that which deeply moves us. And again, we sometimes get tripped up on words when everything you've described, I think, can resonate with people listening. Well, yeah, that is a spectacular moment in even just the most mundane.
Yes. And that actually brings samsara and nirvana together and makes them inseparable. So that in early Buddhism, or in the, you might say, the early understanding of Buddhist practitioners, it feels that samsara is the collective neurosis, it's the world of suffering, and we want to leave that and get to nirvana. We want to get to a place where there's no suffering that transcends money, food, and sex, so to speak. And I think that what you and I are talking about, what you've just stated, is how Buddhism at a later stage understands that there is no escape in this sense. Mm-hmm. We're in the world and we can't leave this world. We have to find our quote-unquote nirvana, our release or our relief, right in the midst of the marketplace, right in the midst of making money, right in the midst of our all kinds of trips that we have about food and substance, that we have to find the sacred in this playground, not elsewhere.
Yeah, exactly. So let's shift a little bit. You're also a psychotherapist, and I wanted to ask if you found that your Buddhist background has been beneficial to how you work with your patients.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it works both ways. Psychotherapy also has shined a light in perhaps some of the unarticulated areas of Buddhism. So they both traditions, I think, shine a light in the unspoken the unspoken areas of each tradition. For psychotherapy and Buddhism, to answer your question, I think that we were talking about the sacred, and much of psychotherapy as it's conventionally practiced across the board is really it's very pathological, it's very sickness-oriented. So the whole field of psychotherapy is a brilliant encyclopedic map of everything that's wrong that we need fixed. And so much of psychotherapy is problem-oriented, sickness-oriented. And having worked at a big HMO, Kaiser, for a number of years in the psychiatry department, the trend in the 21st century is psychopharmacology, which is to relate to symptoms rather than the whole person. To administer medication, chemicals, in order to alleviate symptoms rather than deal with meaning, purpose, and value. So what I've brought my practice to helping relationship psychotherapy is to bring in the notion of the sacred. And in this case, it translated as making every effort to relate to the whole person, to the heart, the belly, as well as the head. To listen to whether this person is finding meaning in their life. Do they hold things of value or not? Is there a loss of value? Do they feel a sense of purpose at all? Or are they rudderless, kind of floating and successful in the worldly sense, but they've kind of lost their inspiration of how to be human? So I think the Buddhist notion of sacredness very much was part of how I worked with my clients and continue to work with my clients in that regard, to sort of hold my mind a map of the further reaches of human potential, and not only try to help clients resolve problems, but also look at what does an optimal human life look like. And the other way around, I think that psychotherapy puts a big emphasis on the personal, the individual, the complexity of personality. And as much as I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Buddhist practitioner, Buddhism can be very generic, very universal. Mm-hmm. And I think the psychotherapy goes to pains to clarify the stuck points in individual personality. And each of us is a unique personality, so that the causes of our suffering may be very specific to the kind of personality we have. And just to work on relieving suffering in the generic sense sometimes doesn't really hit the nail on the head. Whereas if you're speaking to a particular personality hang-up or a blind spot in a specific personality, it's a much shorter path to relieving suffering. And this has been important. Also, Buddhists tend to meditate a great deal and study the Dharma. And
that's our intention anyway.
Right, exactly. That's our intention, and we're known for that. But sometimes we're not known, not sometimes, we're often not given in to dialoguing with each other, specifically around issues that come up. We try to cut through them, and we try to relate the Dharma to our problems as we should. But the point I'm making is that psychotherapy puts a big emphasis on meaningful dialogue, not chatting, but right. Meaningful dialogue, so that individuals can process their issues around substance abuse and not try to transcend it, because it can't be simply transcended. Or their issues around sexuality, the hang-ups around sexuality, the hang-ups around ambition, power, money, aggression. And sometimes the Buddha Dharma doesn't, at least here in the West, it doesn't nail these issues accurately enough. So I find that those Buddhist practitioners that are also psychotherapists or have been in psychotherapy now bring in this element of deep dialogue into the Dharma, which I think is very, very helpful. Particularly here in the Western world, that's our contribution. That's the lens through which the Buddha Dharma shines through in this culture. We're quite psychologically sophisticated as a culture. So I think that's going to be the American contribution to the Dharma.
Let's pivot once more, and I want to have you tell us a little bit about your mindfulness awareness group.
Yeah, this was a post-Kaiser group that I established. While for the years that I was at Kaiser, I was the quote-unquote mindfulness teacher. So I had a long-standing mindfulness group, a la mindfulness-based stress reduction, began that way, sort of the John Kabat-Zinn model. And then I found that based on my years of Zen practice and years of Vajrayana practice, that there were other aspects of Buddha Dharma that I would like to move into. So in addition to, I guess, the MBSR approach, the mindfulness-based stress reduction approach, I began to include more Shambhala teachings, which is a an aspect of Vajrayana, as taught by Trungpa Rinpoche, Trungpa Rinpoche. And then my classes began to expand. The territory opened up and included more Buddha Dharma than I began with in the early years teaching at Kaiser. So I left Kaiser 2-3 years ago, and a number of people came, asked me to keep in touch with them and wanted to know if I was going to do anything after I left Kaiser. And I said, yeah, just look me up. I'll be probably doing a mindfulness awareness group. So the mindfulness, and I called it mindfulness and awareness because those are translations of the Sanskrit terms shamatha and vipassana. So mindfulness, strictly speaking, is shamatha practice, which is more the microscopic aspect of mind, or the microscopic aspect of meditation practice. And awareness, or vipassana, is more panoramic awareness. It includes insight. It includes the more intuitive aspects of mind. And it includes the post-meditation areas, such as money, food, and sex. So the group is called Mindfulness and Awareness because we utilize practices to include everyday life. And the format of the group is we sit for 30 to 40 minutes, and then I give a brief Dharma talk on some aspect of the Dharma, but using a very simple language, using more psychological language, so that 20 folks in the audience can kind of relate it to their, the bread and butter world that they live in. And then a third part of that evening, in addition to Q&A after my Dharma talk, is to break up into little groups of twos and to do some sort of psychological process where they're able to take, whether it's the Four Noble Truths or the 3 Marks of Existence or the 5 Skandhas, so on and so forth, the Eightfold Noble Path, and work in twos and talk about with each other their understanding or their misunderstandings, where they get stuck in trying to work with these teachings. And then we come back together in the larger group, and we all kind of weigh in and have a larger discussion about those themes. And then a few times a year, maybe 5 times a year, we do a 1-day retreat. I rent out a space about 20 miles north of here along the ocean. And we do a full day of sitting practice there'll be a couple of Dharma talks and experiential exercises that I just described. But this is, and interestingly, the book Mindfulness and Madness that was recently published is really based on a series of transcribed talks that come from this group. And I reworked those talks to make them, fit the format of a book that would appeal to a general audience. But that's the heart of the book, Mindfulness and Awareness. It comes from this Mindfulness and Awareness group I've been working with.
It sounds like there's an interesting blend of a traditional group that gets together and meditates, and there's a Dharma talk, as well as some of what we see in MBSR, where there's breaking out into dyads, having more intimate conversation of listening and speaking and switching roles, and then coming back to the larger group to share more. I'm wondering how smooth is that blending? Has that been working well?
It has. I think people in the group really appreciate the opportunity to make time to talk about what matters. That in ordinary life, we're so co-opted by the demands of laundry, shopping, work, family relations, children, paying the mortgage, changing the oil on the car, yada, yada, yada. So that we rarely make time to sit and really unpack what is most meaningful in our lives. And so I think what goes most smoothly is the dyads, when people can talk with each other in this somewhat structured but somewhat free way, and then hear what the larger group, what other individuals have to say about that. What has been challenging for me is to keep the presentations alive, so that when I'm presenting the Dharma, I'm not hearing my own voice. As a teacher, I've taught most of my life, and a therapist the other half of my adult life. It's hard to keep things fresh and to continually be creative in the way that you work with the basic teachings of the Dharma, not going over the heads of individuals, making sure the themes are relevant to their lives in the 21st century. People, mostly Caucasian people living in Northern California. So that's been a challenge. How to keep it fresh, alive, stimulating, both for me as well as for students. But it's been highly rewarding. It's probably the most rewarding thing I do right now in my life. I really, really feel devoted. It's not a money maker. I don't do it for that reason, much like yourself, Ted. This is my offering, something that I could give back. And so it's been revitalizing for me as well as an offering to others.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for doing that and for joining us today. For those of you who are listening to this episode, you can find out more about Ira and his work on his website, wayofthemandala.com. And I'll be linking that on the episode page for this episode, as well as the Facebook page for the Mindfulness Awareness Group. So be sure to check that out. Our guest today, Ira Rechtshaffer. Ira, thanks for being here.
You're quite welcome, Ted. Thanks for this opportunity to dialogue with you.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.